most people are going to get the virus.
Most people are going to get COVID.
Will ultimately find just about everybody. Unfortunately, those who are still unvaccinated are going to get the brunt of the severe aspect of this.
Hearing the acting commissioner at the FDA say most people are going to get COVID.
Right now, everywhere we look, people have COVID. Vaccinated or not, everyone seems to be catching the virus with a whopping 800,000 new cases per day. Because Omicron is spreading like wildfire throughout the country, indiscriminately infecting anyone it comes into contact with, even shut down discussion surrounding the well-known scientific principle of natural immunity. They shut down and even demonized any discussion of potential early treatments, and they failed to give us good instructions on what to do when our loved ones or we ourselves catch COVID. They flat out refused to focus on any of this. They instead swore if we all got the vaccine, the pandemic would end. Well, it didn't end. Everyone is catching COVID. People who got double vaxxed and triple vaxxed and wore double masks and kept their kids out of school and gave up Christmas with family, and even worse, gave up being with their loved ones by their side as they breathed their last breaths because they weren't allowed to be next to them, are catching COVID. Everyone is catching COVID. Somebody tell me, what are you supposed to do when you catch COVID? Seriously, can you answer that question? Besides quarantining yourself and wishing you were vaccinated more than you already are, what are you supposed to do? Do you isolate yourself away from your family and fight the virus alone while hoping and praying you don't need to go to the hospital? Because that's what they've left us with. Why don't we know more about natural immunity and how long it lasts? With so many people getting sick, wouldn't it be helpful to know whether or not people who have already recovered can take on the task of caring for their loved ones who are now ill? The Israelis came out with an enormous study showing natural immunity afforded 13 times more protection against reinfection than vaccination. But quickly, the CDC released its own highly flawed study, claiming the opposite, that previously infected people were more likely to catch the virus than those vaccinated. Signs point towards previous infection being protective to some degree, in the least lessening symptoms when reinfected. And what about the natural immunity younger people seem to have? We've known throughout the pandemic that young people often have very mild illness when infected. But again, the mere mention that they maybe should be less afraid of catching the virus was met with fierce resistance. So here we are now. We have people sick, and yet young and old and previously infected alike are all equally scared. And now people who are sick in bed with COVID who can't get themselves water or Tylenol or food to eat are reliant on the brave in their families to care for them if they're lucky enough to have someone brave at all. Frightened people who otherwise maybe wouldn't need to be frightened because they're younger or previously infected are hiding away and leaving food on doorsteps for loved ones, expecting them to crawl out of bed and care for themselves. And often people don't get the care they need until they've gotten so bad they need hospitalization. Yet here we are, people are fully vaccinated, even boosted, sick in bed, scared, and the best weapon our public health officials have given them against COVID is what? NyQuil?
Is there a concern hearing comments like that from Dr. Woodcock that maybe it'll encourage people to not follow the guidance as much, to not mask up as much, to not hesitate from doing as many public or group activities as they had been, given, you know, if you have this mentality of, well, I'm going to get it anyway, it's inevitable, how does that affect people's behavior, you think?
Yeah, but it seems likelier than not that we need to be careful for probably the next month. It's already peaking in New York, it's peaking in Washington, D.C., there's some evidence that it's peaking in Boston, and the rest of the country likely will peak in a couple of weeks and then come down over the next few weeks after that. And because, in part because I think when we get to February, we'll probably be in a pretty good place. So many people are going to get it that even the unvaccinated, virtually all of them, will have some measure of immunity they should have gotten from a vaccine, but now they'll get it from the virus, assuming they don't succumb to it. And so I think we will find ourselves in a good place. And I don't think the right call is just to say it's inevitable and to throw your hands up at this point.
Right. They've secured about 50 million of the tests. They're still working on getting the rest of them, and they think it could be about 60 days over the next 60 days that you actually see those tests distributed. So I'm wondering what you make of that timeline.
It's a little bit too late. I think the likeliest thing is that all of a sudden we're going to have a lot of tests around about 2, 3, 4 weeks after we really needed them. We need them now.
And so what's your advice to people who are in that situation? Because I've heard the same thing. It's hard to get a rapid test. You can't find one. You try to schedule one. It's several days before you can actually get an appointment. And so what should people be doing if they're worried that they are infected in that period?
Yeah, you're in a sticky situation if you have symptoms that can be COVID, and the problem is they're pretty almost everything. You know, a fever, a sore throat, a cough, any of those things. At this point, the disease is so prevalent, so many people have it, that I think the right assumption is that you have it until you can get tested. And once you make that assumption, what you should do is isolate yourself and, stay home, don't come in contact with other people, and wait until you can get a test to confirm that. I don't think there's any way to be sure whether you have COVID if you have compatible symptoms and when it's as prevalent as it is. The best estimates, even here in San Francisco, which is a highly vaccinated city, is right now about 1 in 10 people walking around the street have it, and our test positivity rate for people that have symptoms is about 40%.
As I've said on previous pressers here from the White House, that we're not going to eradicate this. We've only done that with smallpox. We're not going to eliminate that. That only happens with massive vaccination programs like we did with measles and with vaccines, but we ultimately will control it. And if you control it in a way, it's at such a low level and people are vaccinated and boosted, sooner or later, as we begin to live with it, what she was referring to is that virtually everybody is going to wind up getting exposed and likely get infected. But if you're vaccinated and if you're boosted, the chances of you getting sick are very, very low.
First one, will every person exposed to COVID-19 get it? Why or why not?
Excellent question, and it has to do with the viral load, viral inoculum, infectious dose principle of infectious disease. The short answer is no, they won't, right? You have to take into account host factors, so that if someone has a weakened or compromised immune system, or obesity or diabetes, things that make them higher risk for getting infected with COVID-19. And then you have to take into account viral factors. Let's say one particle of SARS-CoV-2 isn't probably not enough to make someone sick, but let's say 1 million particles would be. So a lot of factors at play here, and we still don't know what the infectious dose of this virus is.
Here's the question. If everyone was vaccinated, could COVID-19 be eradicated?
Realistically, the answer is no, according to infectious disease experts and epidemiologists. Ideally or theoretically, yes, if the entire world were vaccinated, absolutely. That's that concept of herd immunity. Everyone has a level of protection. There's literally, it's like the virus bumping into a concrete wall. There's nowhere for it to go. But with people unvaccinated, with variants, with waning immunity, most infectious disease specialists and epidemiologists say it is unlikely/impossible.
But we haven't eradicated.
Does cannabis prevent COVID? A recent study identified that 2 compounds commonly found in hemp, cannabidiolic acid and cannabidiolic acid, could bind to the coronavirus and possibly block a crucial stage in how it infects people. Both compounds appeared to hinder the virus's ability to infect human cells in laboratory tests, the researchers found, after testing alpha and beta variants of the coronavirus. Since finding candidates for possible drugs and treatments can be an expensive and time-consuming process, researchers speed things up by testing a large number of known compounds to see if they produce a biological or chemical response in line with what might be expected in a drug treating the condition they are trying to find treatment for. Positive responses at this stage, like the cannabis compounds, are but the first of many filters the compounds must pass, and, assuming all goes well, an approved drug could still be more than a decade away. We spoke with Dr. Michael Sodergren, who heads Imperial College London's Medical Cannabis Research Group, and he told Forbes the results were interesting, but cautioned the findings would need to be confirmed in animal models and tested on humans in clinical trials. This data does not prove cannabis compounds can prevent or cure COVID infection in humans, Sodergren said, and provides no evidence to support the smoking or ingestion of cannabis products to do the same.
We found that there are 3 compounds in hemp, all cannabinoids, which binds to the spike protein of the SARS coronavirus 2 that causes COVID. Then we were able to test 2 of these compounds called CBDA and CBGA, and we found that these 2 compounds are effective individually in preventing the virus from infecting human cells. Our studies at this point are preclinical. They are laboratory-based, cell-based, in vitro experiments with cell culture and live virus. We are in the process of developing hoping to work with clinicians to establish the efficacy of these compounds in clinical trials. So people who've been exposed to other individuals with COVID and need to isolate could take a pill like a cannabinoid extract and stay healthy because of the antiviral capability of these compounds. People ought not to be relying on them, say, when hospitalized with severe COVID infections. I wouldn't advocate for using cannabinoids to treat them to get well. We anticipate that ingesting these compounds as pills, tablets, that sort of thing, as dietary supplements or as pill form as medicines will be more effective than smoking or vaping because the acid forms of the cannabinoids like CBDA are sensitive to heat.
Richard says cannabinoids have a long history of safety with respect to human consumption and use.
We believe that quite quickly we'll be able to move from these preclinical findings to the clinic and demonstrate efficacy in people. The reason we can move quickly is because of the experience we already have had with over-the-counter hemp preparations and extracts containing cannabinoids. I'm very hopeful that we'll see clinical evidence during the next several months that cannabinoids and cannabinoid mixtures can prevent COVID from occurring in people exposed to the virus.
Here at Bayou City Hemp Company, they bring in the plant, grind it, extract the oils, freeze it, heat it, and create CBD products. I know you've heard of CBD, but that's just one of more than 200 different types of cannabinoids, which they're really just starting to scratch the surface of how this can be used in health. In a study at Oregon State University, scientists working with cells in a petri dish found hemp extract may block the spike protein of the coronavirus from infecting your cells. What they're experimenting with are cannabinoid acids like this CBDA right here. This is not present in controlled substances like THC, the ingredient in marijuana that creates a high.
These cannabinoids, when they were tested against the coronavirus, they found out that these cannabinoids are binding actually to the spike proteins.
Andrew Pardo, Bayou City Hemp Company's scientist in charge of testing their products, says CBDA can interact with the coronavirus's spike protein, but it's also possible that won't mean anything for humans.
It's our starting point. Before we move on to large organisms where the system gets really complicated, we start off with something that can be controlled.
In Texas, it's legal to buy, sell, and manufacture hemp extracts and compounds in cosmetics, lotions, and dietary supplements. And Pardo tells me since the release of the COVID study, there's been a growth in demand for CBDA specifically.
COVID-19 may be blocked by cannabis compounds, study says. According to researchers, certain acids found in the marijuana flower have been found to bind to the spike protein in SARS-CoV-2 and block its ability to infect other organisms.
Researchers say during the study, two compounds, CBG and CBD, commonly found in hemp, bound to the spike proteins found on the virus and blocked them from infecting people. But the cannabis has to be in edible form, not smoked or vaped. The study is considered promising by some. While the study is interesting, it's in vitro only, and Newman says more human studies are needed to verify. And though cannabis does have many reported medical benefits, he says the jury is still out on coronavirus protection.
Recently, just about a few weeks ago, this was in the first week of October, a research team from Sweden published information that showed in their human cells that they were studying that the spike protein can actually enter nucleus. And the reason why this is such a dramatic news and why it's such a game changer is the fact that obviously nucleus houses our genetic material, all of our DNA, almost all of our DNA. Mitochondria is the other place where you might find DNA. And what they also showed, and normally entry into the nucleus is supposed to be verboten, you're not supposed to be going inside there, precisely because you could potentially be modulating how we're using our genetics. Now, what did they discover is that once the spike protein enters the nucleus, it actually inhibits proper fixing of broken, damaged DNA. And specifically damage of DNA where you introduce double-stranded break, meaning really you break both strands of the DNA, you shear the DNA in half, you break it in half. And the way it does negatively impact how the DNA is being fixed is by somehow, it's still unknown, somehow interfering with how BRCA1 protein is supposed to be used in fixing that DNA damage.
How someone's body will react to a COVID-19 infection depends on many factors. Part of how you will react depends on genetics and how much of the virus you take in.
World health leaders are warning that Omicron will most likely not be the last COVID variant we see.
A senior official from the World Health Organization says the high levels of transmission around the world give the coronavirus plenty of opportunities to replicate and mutate.
I wish I could really say that the pandemic is winding down, but that's likely not going to happen just yet. Not good news there. Globally, there have been almost 19 million cases of COVID in the last week. That's up 20% from the previous week, and the week prior to that had seen a climb of 50%. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of opportunity for this Omicron to spread and for then it to cause hospitalization and death. Part of that's because of the low immunization rates all throughout the world in developing countries. The World Health Organization, get this, has pushed for equal distribution worldwide, but that has not happened, right? We have less than 10% of residents in developing countries that have received one shot of COVID-19 vaccine. So these low immunization rates combined with an incredibly contagious variant like Omicron means the door is wide open for this virus to mutate.
A new national record for France. Here, every second, more than 2 people are testing positive for the coronavirus. Police patrols have stepped up in response. They visit bars and restaurants checking people's vaccination passes. And for the still unvaccinated, French authorities have a grim message.
There is really very little chance you can escape it this time. The virus is spreading too fast and unvaccinated people are more likely to get infected or very sick.
Germany, too, is putting more pressure on the unvaccinated, leading to several protests across the country. In Munich, police initially banned a rally, but protesters came out anyway by the thousands, saying they're just out for a walk. There is also concern that Germany is underreporting cases due to staff shortages.
This morning, the Cabinet concluded that because of the extraordinary booster campaign, together with the way the public have responded to the Plan B measures, we can return to Plan A in England and allow Plan B regulations to expire. As a result, from the start of Thursday next week, mandatory certification will end. Organisations can, of course, choose to use the NHS COVID pass voluntarily, but we will end the compulsory use of COVID status certification in England. From now on, the government is no longer asking people to work from home. And people should now speak to their employers about arrangements for returning to the office. And having looked at the data carefully, the Cabinet concluded that once regulations lapse, the government will no longer mandate the wearing of face masks anywhere. From tomorrow, we will no longer require face masks in classrooms, and the Department for Education will shortly remove national guidance on their use in communal areas. In the country at large, we will continue to suggest the use of face coverings in enclosed or crowded spaces, particularly when you come into contact with people you don't normally meet, but we will trust the judgment of the British people and no longer criminalise anyone who chooses not to wear one. The government will also ease restrictions further on visits to care homes, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, will set out plans in the coming days. Mr. Speaker, as we return to Plan A, the House will know that some measures still remain, including those on self-isolation. In particular, it is still a legal requirement for those who have tested positive for COVID to self-isolate. On Monday, we reduced the isolation period to 5 full days with 2 negative tests, and there will soon come a time when we can remove the legal requirement to self-isolate altogether, just as we don't place legal obligations on people to isolate if they have flu. As COVID becomes endemic, we will need to replace legal requirements with advice and guidance urging people with the virus to be careful and considerate of others. The self-isolation regulations expire on the 24th of March, at which point I very much expect not to renew them.
China is locking down millions of its citizens as it relentlessly pursues COVID-0. Factories, ports, steel mills and manufacturing hubs have all been forced to shut down over handfuls of cases.
We're going to feel it across the board. There is going to be a significant impact on the Australian economy from China's hard